March 15th, 2004, 9:27 p.m. A frantic 911 call pierces through the quiet evening in Modesto, California. A man's voice, trembling and desperate, reports his pregnant wife missing. Scott Peterson told police he'd been fishing alone at Berkeley Marina. He came home to an empty house. Christmas Eve decorations still hanging. Their dog wandering the yard with its leash on. Laci Peterson, 8 months pregnant with their son, Connor, had simply vanished. The nation watched as a loving husband pleaded for his wife's return on national television. Volunteers searched day and night. Prayer vigils filled the streets. Everyone believed Scott Peterson was a grieving husband desperately searching for his family. Everyone except the detectives who were quietly watching his every move. Because while America saw a devoted husband, investigators were uncovering a web of lies so elaborate, so calculated, that it would take months to unravel. This is the story of how one man fooled his family, his community, and nearly escaped justice for one of the most infamous crimes of the 21st century. This is the story of Laci and Scott Peterson, a case that captivated America and revealed the devastating truth behind a picture-perfect marriage. What started as a missing persons case would evolve into a murder investigation that exposed secrets, affairs, and a carefully constructed facade that fooled almost everyone. The investigation revealed details that would shock even seasoned detectives and forever change how we look at the faces we see pleading for help on our television screens. Laci Denise Rocha grew up in Modesto, California, known for her infectious smile and warm personality. She graduated from California Polytechnic State University in 1997 with a degree in ornamental horticulture. Those who knew her described her as vibrant, loving, and excited about life. She was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered, who remembered birthdays, who made everyone feel special. She met Scott Peterson at a restaurant in 1994. He was handsome, charming, working toward his degree in agricultural business. To everyone who knew them, they seemed like the perfect couple. Young, attractive, seemingly in love. They married in 1997 at Sycamore Mineral Springs Resort in San Luis Obispo County. Friends and family celebrated what appeared to be a fairy tale union. Scott found work in the fertilizer industry, eventually becoming a sales representative. Laci substitute taught and later worked at a local nursery before focusing on preparing for motherhood. By all outward appearances, they had built an enviable life together. They purchased a modest home on Covina Avenue in Modesto's La Loma neighborhood. They talked about their future, about raising their son Connor, about growing their family. Laci was meticulous in preparing the nursery, painting it in soft colors, selecting each piece of furniture with care. She attended prenatal appointments religiously. Her due date was February 10th, 2004. She was counting down the days. But beneath this carefully curated image, cracks were forming that no one could see. Scott Peterson was living a double life, one that would soon be exposed in the most devastating way possible. Before we dive deeper into this investigation, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Here at True Crime Vault, we unlock the cases that deserve to be remembered. New investigations every week. What do you think happened to Laci Peterson? Drop your theory in the comments below. December 24th, 2003, Christmas Eve. Scott Peterson called Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, at 5:17 p.m. He told her Laci was missing. He claimed he'd left that morning around 9:30 a.m. to go fishing at Berkeley Marina, about 90 miles from their home. When he returned around 4:30 p.m., Laci wasn't there. Her car was in the driveway. Her purse was inside. Their dog, a golden retriever named Mackenzie, was in the backyard wearing his leash, covered in mud. Scott said Laci had planned to walk Mackenzie, then do some grocery shopping and baking. She told him she was going to make gingerbread cookies. The washing machine was running, suggesting she'd been home doing laundry, but Laci was gone. Sharon immediately called 911. Within minutes, Modesto Police Department officers arrived at the Peterson home. They found Scott in the driveway, seemingly calm, eating pizza. This detail would later strike investigators as unusual. Your 8 months pregnant wife is missing, and you're eating? Officer Evers took Scott's statement. Scott explained his movements that day in detail. Too much detail, some would later say. He described the 14-pound boat he'd recently purchased, explaining he'd gone to Berkeley Marina to fish for sturgeon. He couldn't remember what lures he used. He couldn't describe specifically where he'd fished. When asked if he'd caught anything, he said no. He'd made 1 cast, maybe 2, then he just sat in his boat. The story immediately struck detectives as odd. Who drives 90 miles on Christmas Eve to fish in the San Francisco Bay when you're about to become a father? Why would Laci, 8 months pregnant, go for a walk alone in a park known to have homeless encampments? Nothing about Scott's timeline made immediate sense, but police initially treated it as a missing persons case. They had no body, no crime scene, no obvious evidence of foul play. Search efforts began immediately. Hundreds of volunteers combed through parks, fields, and neighborhoods. The Rocha family organized massive search parties, distributing flyers with Laci's photograph throughout California. The community rallied. Candlelight vigils were held. Local businesses donated resources. Everyone wanted to believe Laci would be found safe. Scott appeared at these vigils. He gave interviews to local news stations, his voice breaking as he described his missing wife. He wore a missing persons pin with Laci's photo. He told reporters he was cooperating fully with police. He said he just wanted his wife and son to come home. To the public, he looked like a devastated husband. But behind the scenes, Modesto Police Department detectives were developing serious concerns about Scott's story and his behavior. Detective John Bowler and Detective Craig Grogan were assigned as lead investigators. They began by carefully analyzing Scott's timeline. On the morning of December 24th, Scott claimed he woke around 8 a.m. Laci was watching Martha Stewart on television. He ate breakfast, then decided spontaneously to go fishing instead of playing golf as he'd originally planned. He loaded his new boat and left around 9:30 a.m. He arrived at Berkeley Marina around noon. He fished for maybe an hour. Then he drove home, arriving around 4:30 p.m. Detectives immediately noticed inconsistencies. The weather on December 24th was cold and drizzly, hardly ideal fishing conditions. Scott's boat and fishing equipment showed minimal use. His clothes weren't particularly wet or dirty. When police examined his truck and boat, they found very little evidence he'd actually fished at all. There was no bait in his boat, no tackle preparation, no fish scales. Nothing to suggest he'd spent significant time fishing. For a man who claimed to have driven 90 miles to fish, he had remarkably little to show for it. Then there was Scott's demeanor. Multiple officers noted he seemed unusually calm, almost detached for a man whose pregnant wife had just disappeared. He wasn't frantically calling hospitals. He wasn't visibly distraught. He was cooperative, yes, but in a way that felt rehearsed, calculated. When asked about his relationship with Laci, Scott described it as wonderful, perfect. No problems whatsoever. Detectives knew from experience that very few marriages are truly perfect, especially with a baby on the way. On December 26th, 2 days after Laci's disappearance, detectives conducted a more thorough search of the Peterson home. They found Laci's purse, wallet, and keys inside. Her car was parked in the driveway, a bucket of water and cleaning supplies inside, suggesting she'd planned to wash it but never did. The house was relatively clean and organized. In the master bedroom, investigators photographed the bed, which appeared slept in on both sides. Everything looked normal. Too normal, perhaps. What detectives didn't find was equally telling. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, no indication that anyone besides Scott and Laci had been in that house. If someone had abducted Laci, they'd left no trace. This led investigators to focus more intensely on the one person who'd definitely been there that morning, Scott Peterson. As detectives dug deeper into Scott's background, they discovered something he'd conveniently failed to mention. Scott Peterson was having an affair. Her name was Amber Frey, a massage therapist from Fresno, and she had no idea Scott was married, let alone that his wife was 8 months pregnant. The discovery of Amber Frey changed everything. On December 30th, 2003, Detective Bueller received a call from a woman who identified herself as a friend of Amber Frey. She said Amber had been dating Scott Peterson and had just learned from news coverage that he was married and his wife was missing. Amber wanted to cooperate with police. She was horrified, devastated, and willing to help in any way possible. Detectives met with Amber on December 30th. She was a 27-year-old single mother who'd been introduced to Scott on November 20th, 2003, barely a month before Laci's disappearance. The person who introduced them told Amber that Scott was unmarried and ready for a serious relationship. Scott had presented himself as a wealthy businessman who traveled internationally. He told Amber elaborate stories about his life. He said he'd lost his wife years ago and was ready to move on. He talked about wanting to be a father to Amber's young daughter. He seemed perfect, charming, attentive, generous. Their relationship progressed quickly. Scott sent romantic text messages. He called her multiple times daily. He talked about their future together. He made plans to spend New Year's Eve with her. On December 9th, 2003, just 15 days before Laci disappeared, Scott told Amber he was traveling to Europe for business and wouldn't be back until after the holidays. This would be his excuse for being unavailable during the period when Laci went missing. He was already constructing his alibi, already laying groundwork for his lies. When Amber saw Scott on the news describing his missing pregnant wife, she was stunned. Everything he told her was a lie. She immediately contacted her friend, who contacted police. Amber agreed to work with investigators, even offering to record future phone conversations with Scott. This cooperation would prove absolutely crucial to the investigation, because Scott Peterson, believing Amber still had no idea about Laci, continued calling her, continued lying to her, continued trying to maintain their relationship, even as the nation searched for his missing wife. The recordings Amber provided were devastating. On December 31st, 2003, Scott called Amber from a New Year's Eve celebration. He told her he was calling from Paris, that he was near the Eiffel Tower, that he could hear the celebrations around him. In reality, he was at a candlelight vigil for his missing wife in Modesto. While Laci's family wept and prayed, Scott Peterson was on the phone with his mistress, maintaining his elaborate lie. The audio captured the sounds of the vigil in the background, memorial bells ringing, voices crying out for Laci. Yet Scott told Amber he was in Paris, describing fireworks he wasn't seeing, claiming to be 6,000 miles from where he actually stood. This call revealed something crucial about Scott Peterson's character. He was a practiced, convincing liar. He could fabricate elaborate stories without hesitation. He could maintain multiple deceptions simultaneously. And he showed no visible guilt about lying to Amber while his pregnant wife was missing, while his in-laws were desperately searching, while the entire community mourned. Detectives interviewed Scott multiple times in early January 2004. Each interview revealed more inconsistencies. Scott's story kept changing in small but significant ways. First, he said he used one type of lure fishing. Then he said a different type. He couldn't remember exactly where he'd launched his boat. He couldn't describe other fishermen he might have seen. His timeline shifted by 15 minutes in one direction, then 20 minutes in another. These weren't major changes, but they suggested someone trying to remember a fabricated story rather than recalling actual events. On January 14, 2004, detectives confronted Scott about Amber Frey. They told him they knew about the affair. They knew he'd been lying. Scott initially denied everything, then admitted the relationship, but claimed it was insignificant. He said he'd told Laci about Amber on December 9th, and Laci had been understanding. Detectives didn't believe him. They'd found no evidence Laci knew about the affair. Friends and family said Laci had seemed happy and excited about the baby, planning for their future together. If she'd known her husband was cheating, she'd shown no signs. Scott tried to explain away the affair. He said it was a mistake. He said it meant nothing. He said he loved Laci and only wanted her back. But his actions told a different story. Even after Laci's disappearance made national news, Scott continued calling Amber, continued lying to her, continued trying to maintain their relationship. He never ended things with Amber. He never confessed. He only stopped when she confronted him with the truth she'd learned from detectives. What kind of man carries on an affair while his pregnant wife is missing? What kind of man lies to his mistress about being in Paris while attending a candlelight vigil for his wife? These questions haunted investigators and would later haunt a jury. While detectives built their case, the search for Laci continued. In early January 2004, police received hundreds of tips. People reported seeing a pregnant woman matching Laci's description in various locations. Some witnesses said they'd seen a pregnant woman walking in East La Loma Park around 9:30 or 10 a.m. on December 24th. Others reported seeing suspicious vehicles in the neighborhood. Each lead was investigated thoroughly. Each one led nowhere. The homeless population in East La Loma Park received particular attention. Scott's defense team would later argue that Laci was abducted by transients while walking Mackenzie. Several witnesses reported seeing a pregnant woman near the park that morning, but timeline analysis showed problems with these sightings. Laci's neighbors saw her the evening of December 23rd. Scott claimed he left around 9:30 a.m. on December 24th. For these witness sightings to be accurate, Laci would have needed to be alive and walking in the park after Scott left. But investigators increasingly doubted Scott's timeline was truthful. Detectives also examined the possibility of a burglary gone wrong. Across the street from the Petersons' home, a house was burglarized on December 26th. The burglars later claimed they'd also burglarized that same house on December 24th. Could they have encountered Laci and abducted her? Investigators looked closely at this possibility, but the timeline didn't work. The burglars said they entered the house around 11 a.m. on December 24th, hours after witnesses said they'd seen Laci. Additionally, there was no evidence connecting these burglars to Laci's disappearance. Their stories were inconsistent and unreliable. Detectives ultimately concluded this was a coincidence, not a connection. As weeks passed without finding Laci, media attention intensified. The case drew national coverage. Cable news networks featured the story nightly. Nancy Grace devoted multiple segments to dissecting Scott's behavior. Court TV analyzed every detail. America became obsessed with the handsome, seemingly devoted husband who many were beginning to suspect had murdered his pregnant wife. Scott's behavior during this time did nothing to help his image. He appeared on Good Morning America on January 28, 2004. Diane Sawyer asked him directly about the affair. Scott admitted it, but claimed it was brief and meaningless. When asked if he'd killed his wife, Scott looked directly at the camera and said no. He said he had nothing to hide. He said he was cooperating fully with police. But his demeanor came across as cold, detached, lacking the raw emotion people expected from a grieving husband. America watched and judged. Behind the scenes, investigators were methodically building their case. They examined Scott's finances, looking for evidence he'd purchased weapons, chemicals, or anything that could be used to commit murder. They found he'd increased his life insurance on Laci to $250,000 shortly before her disappearance. They discovered he'd been researching San Francisco Bay currents and tides. They learned he'd purchased a 14-foot aluminum boat with cash 2 weeks before Laci vanished and hadn't told anyone, including his wife. He'd never mentioned owning the boat to friends or family. Why would someone secretly buy a boat if they planned to use it innocently? Detectives also examined Scott's computer. His internet search history from the days before Laci's disappearance was revealing. He'd searched for information about San Francisco Bay. He'd looked at tide charts for Berkeley Marina. He'd researched water currents and depths. These searches were made days before December 24th, before Scott claimed he'd spontaneously decided to go fishing there. This suggested premeditation. This suggested planning. This suggested Scott Peterson knew exactly where he was going on December 24th because he'd already decided what he was going to do. But investigators still lacked the most crucial piece of evidence: Laci's body. Without a body, building a murder case would be extraordinarily difficult. Prosecutors could charge Scott with murder based on circumstantial evidence alone, but convicting him would be much harder. The community continued to hope Laci would be found alive, even as weeks turned into months and hope faded. Then, on April 13th, 2004, a couple walking their dog along the rocky shoreline of Point Isabel Regional Shoreline in Richmond, California, made a grim discovery. They found the decomposed body of a late-term male fetus washed up on the rocks. The location was approximately 1 mile from Berkeley Marina, where Scott claimed he'd been fishing on December 24th. The next day, April 14th, another body washed ashore at Point Isabel, just a few miles from where the fetus had been found. It was the badly decomposed remains of a woman. Her head and all 4 limbs were missing. She was wearing maternity pants. The body had been in the water for months. Marine life and decomposition had taken their toll, but DNA testing would soon confirm what investigators already suspected. These were the remains of Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The discovery of the bodies changed everything. After months of speculation, investigators finally had physical evidence. The location was absolutely crucial. Laci and Connor were found within a mile of Berkeley Marina, the exact location where Scott claimed he'd been fishing alone on December 24th. The odds of this being coincidental were astronomical. Of all the places along the California coast, Laci's body washed up at the precise location Scott had chosen for his alleged fishing trip. Forensic examination of Laci's remains was difficult due to the severe decomposition. The medical examiner couldn't definitively determine cause of death. There were no obvious signs of trauma, but months in the water had destroyed much of the evidence. What they could determine was that Laci hadn't given birth before her death. Connor was still in utero when Laci died, though his body was found separately, having been expelled from Laci's body during decomposition. The autopsy showed nylon tape wrapped around Connor's body, though it was unclear if this was connected to the crime or had become entangled with the remains in the water. Without a clear cause of death, prosecutors would need to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence to prove murder. But the location of the bodies was damning. Prosecutors could now argue that Scott had taken Laci's body to Berkeley Marina, weighted it down, and dumped it in the San Francisco Bay. When he returned on December 24th, claiming to be fishing, he was actually disposing of evidence. Perhaps making sure the weights hadn't failed. Perhaps checking to ensure the body had sunk. On April 18, 2004, 5 days after the first remains were discovered, Modesto police arrested Scott Peterson in San Diego near the Mexican border. He'd dyed his hair blonde. He'd grown a goatee. His truck contained camping gear, multiple cell phones, $15,000 in cash, his brother's driver's license, and 4 separate credit cards belonging to family members. He had Viagra and survival equipment. To investigators and prosecutors, this looked like a man preparing to flee the country. Scott's attorneys would later claim he was simply camping, and the other items were coincidental. But the timing of his arrest, his changed appearance, and the contents of his vehicle suggested a man who knew arrest was imminent and was preparing to run. Scott was charged with 2 counts of murder. First-degree murder for killing Laci and second-degree murder for killing Connor. California law allowed for the separate murder charge for the unborn child since Connor was past the point of viability. Scott pleaded not guilty to both charges. His trial would become one of the most watched criminal proceedings in American history. The trial of Scott Peterson began on June 1st, 2004 in Redwood City, California, after being moved from Modesto due to excessive pretrial publicity. Judge Alfred DeLucchi presided. The prosecution team was led by Stanislaus County Deputy District Attorney Rick DiStasso, with David Harris and Birgit Flatiger assisting. Scott's defense team was led by celebrity attorney Mark Garagos, who'd previously represented Michael Jackson and Winona Ryder. Jury selection took months. The case had received such extensive media coverage that finding impartial jurors was extremely difficult. The trial itself wouldn't begin in earnest until late June, with opening statements finally delivered on June 1st. The prosecution's case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. They had no murder weapon. They had no crime scene. They had no witnesses to the actual murder. They had no confession. What they had was a web of lies, suspicious behavior, and the undeniable fact that Laci's body was found exactly where Scott claimed to have been fishing the day she disappeared. Prosecutor Rick DiStasso laid out the state's theory in his opening statement. Scott Peterson had grown tired of married life. He didn't want to be a father. He wanted to continue his affair with Amber Frey without the complication of a wife and child. So he planned to murder Laci and dump her body in San Francisco Bay. He researched the bay, purchased a boat in secret, and created an alibi. On the morning of December 24th, he killed Laci in their home. The prosecution theorized he may have suffocated her, though they couldn't prove it. He loaded her body into his truck, drove to Berkeley Marina, and disposed of her body. Then he called Laci's mother, reported her missing, and began his elaborate performance as a grieving husband. The prosecution presented over 180 witnesses and more than 500 pieces of evidence. They called Amber Frey to the stand, where she testified for several days about her relationship with Scott and played the recorded phone calls. These recordings were devastating. In one particularly damning call, Scott coldly discussed their future relationship while Laci's family held a vigil. In another, he told Amber he'd lost his wife, and this would be the first holidays without her, statements made 2 weeks before Laci disappeared. This suggested Scott had been planning her murder and already knew she wouldn't be there for the holidays. The prosecution called Laci's mother Sharon Rocha, who testified about her daughter's excitement about the pregnancy and her loving relationship with her family. Sharon described the last time she saw Laci alive on December 15th at a Christmas party. Laci had been radiant, happy, showing off her pregnant belly. Sharon's testimony was emotional and powerful, reminding the jury that this case wasn't just about abstract legal theories. It was about a real woman, a real baby, a real family destroyed. Forensic experts testified about the remains and the timeline of decomposition. While they couldn't pinpoint an exact time of death, their analysis suggested Laci had been in the water since late December, consistent with Scott's December 24th trip to Berkeley Marina. Oceanographers testified about bay currents and tides, explaining how a body dumped at Berkeley Marina in late December would likely wash up exactly where Laci's remains were found in April. The scientific evidence was complex, but pointed consistently towards Scott's guilt. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony about Scott's behavior after Laci's disappearance. Multiple witnesses described his unusual calmness, his lack of emotion, his strange priorities. While volunteers searched day and night, Scott watched golf on TV. While Laci's family held vigils, Scott talked on the phone with his mistress. He sold Laci's car just weeks after she disappeared. He inquired about turning her life insurance money into gold. He referred to Laci in the past tense before her body had even been found. These weren't proof of murder, but they painted a picture of a man who wasn't genuinely searching for his missing wife because he already knew she was dead. Mark Garagos, Scott's defense attorney, faced a formidable challenge. He had to explain away a mountain of circumstantial evidence without offering a coherent alternative theory of what happened to Laci. In his opening statement, Garagos promised to prove Scott was innocent and suggested that Laci had been kidnapped by strangers, possibly the burglars who targeted the neighborhood around the same time. But as the trial progressed, Garagos struggled to make this theory credible. The defense called far fewer witnesses than the prosecution. They attempted to create reasonable doubt by highlighting what the prosecution couldn't prove. They pointed out there was no physical evidence tying Scott to the murder. No blood, no DNA, no murder weapon, no crime scene. They argued that the dog being found with his leash on proved Laci had been walking him when she was abducted. They suggested the witnesses who saw a pregnant woman in the park on December 24th had actually seen Laci, meaning she was alive after Scott left for his fishing trip. But the defense couldn't explain the most damaging evidence. They couldn't explain why Laci's body was found at Berkeley Marina. They couldn't explain Scott's affair and his lies to Amber. They couldn't explain his changed appearance and apparent flight preparations when he was arrested. They couldn't explain his eerily calm behavior while his wife was missing. Mark Garagos attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's timeline and create alternative scenarios, but nothing he presented was as compelling as the simple narrative the prosecution offered. Scott Peterson killed his wife and dumped her body in the bay, then lied about it for months. The trial lasted nearly 6 months, concluding in November 2004. After a week of deliberations, during which one juror was dismissed and replaced with an alternate due to misconduct, the jury returned its verdict. On November 12, 2004, Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for killing Laci and second-degree murder for killing Connor. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Laci's family wept with relief. Scott showed no visible reaction, staring straight ahead. The penalty phase began immediately. Prosecutors argued Scott deserved the death penalty for the cold-blooded, premeditated murder of his pregnant wife. They presented impact statements from Laci's family describing the devastating loss they'd suffered. Sharon Rocha addressed Scott directly, telling him he'd not only taken her daughter's life, but had also stolen her grandson, her future, her dreams of being a grandmother. Her words were powerful and heartbreaking. The defense argued for life imprisonment instead of death, claiming Scott didn't deserve execution. They called character witnesses who testified about Scott's kindness and positive qualities, but the jury was unmoved. On December 13, 2004, they recommended the death penalty. Judge DeLucchi formally sentenced Scott to death on March 16, 2005. Scott Peterson was sent to San Quentin State Prison to await execution. But the legal battle was far from over. Scott's attorneys immediately began the appeals process, arguing numerous errors had occurred during the trial. They claimed pre-trial publicity had made a fair trial impossible. They argued juror misconduct had tainted the verdict. They claimed the evidence was insufficient to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. These appeals would take years to wind through the California court system. In 2012, the California Supreme Court upheld Scott's conviction but ordered a review of the penalty phase due to potential juror misconduct. One juror, it was discovered, hadn't disclosed during jury selection that she'd been a victim of domestic violence and had sought a restraining order while pregnant. Defense attorneys argued this juror had been biased against Scott from the beginning. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned Scott's death sentence, though his murder conviction stood. The court ruled that potential jurors who opposed the death penalty had been improperly dismissed during jury selection. Scott was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Scott has maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration. In 2017, his attorneys filed motions seeking new DNA testing of evidence, claiming advances in technology might reveal the real killer. They've continued to argue that Laci was kidnapped and murdered by strangers. In 2021, Scott's case gained renewed attention when the Los Angeles Innocence Project took on his case, investigating whether he deserved a new trial. As of 2024, Scott Peterson remains in Mather State Prison, serving life without parole. But legal proceedings aside, the question that haunted America in 2004 remains. How did Scott Peterson fool so many people for so long? His family, his friends, even Laci herself never suspected the darkness behind his charming smile. Amber Frey was completely deceived by his lies. The community rallied around him, believing he was a grieving husband. How did he maintain this facade? Psychologists who studied the case suggest Scott displayed classic traits of a narcissistic personality. He was charming and charismatic, able to manipulate people's emotions to get what he wanted. He lied effortlessly, without apparent guilt or remorse. He showed a stunning lack of empathy, continuing his affair even while the nation searched for his missing wife. He believed he was smarter than everyone else, that he could outsmart police, that he could literally get away with murder. This arrogance ultimately contributed to his downfall. If he'd shown genuine emotion, if he'd been more consistent in his lies, if he'd ended things with Amber immediately, he might have been harder to convict. But his narcissism wouldn't allow him to stop performing, stop lying, stop believing he could control the narrative. The case also revealed how dangerous seemingly perfect relationships can be. To outsiders, Scott and Laci appeared to have an ideal marriage. But behind closed doors, Scott was living a double life, feeling trapped by impending fatherhood, planning an escape. The tragedy is that divorce was an option. Scott could have left Laci. It would have been painful, complicated, but legal. Instead, he chose murder. He chose to end two innocent lives rather than face the consequences of his choices. Laci's family has worked tirelessly to keep her memory alive. Sharon Rocha published a book for Laci describing her daughter's life and the aftermath of her murder. The Rocha family established scholarships in Laci's name. They've advocated for victims' rights legislation. They've ensured that Connor is remembered not just as a victim, but as the child who never got to live, who never got to laugh or play or experience life. In their grief, they've found purpose. The Peterson case changed American culture in subtle but significant ways. It contributed to the rise of true crime as entertainment, with cable news devoting unprecedented coverage to a single murder case. It sparked debates about how we judge defendants, particularly attractive white defendants who don't fit our stereotypes of what killers look like. It reminded us that the smiling face on television, the grieving spouse pleading for help, might be hiding unspeakable evil. Scott Peterson looked like someone's neighbor, someone's friend, someone's son. That ordinariness made his crimes even more chilling. Evidence that didn't make it into the trial has continued to emerge over the years. Investigators found that Scott had searched for high-velocity rifles online, though he claimed to own no such weapons. They discovered he'd researched how to make homemade explosives and had looked up information about disposing of bodies. His computer history painted a picture of someone obsessed with violence and death. While this evidence was ultimately deemed too prejudicial to present at trial, it further suggests Scott's dark mindset in the months before Laci disappeared. The affair with Amber Frey remained a focal point of public fascination. Amber wrote her own book, Witness for the Prosecution of Scott Peterson, describing her relationship with Scott and her cooperation with police. She detailed how charming Scott had been, how convincing his lies were, how devastated she was to learn the truth. Amber's willingness to record conversations with Scott and testify against him was crucial to the prosecution. Without her cooperation, convicting Scott would have been far more difficult. She showed remarkable courage in facing public scrutiny and doing what she believed was right. The question of exactly when and how Scott killed Laci has never been definitively answered. The prosecution theorized he killed her in their home on the morning of December 24th, possibly while she slept. Others have speculated he killed her the night before, on December 23rd, giving himself more time to dispose of the body. Without a clear cause of death or time of death, we can only speculate. What we know is that at some point, Scott Peterson made the decision to end his wife's life and the life of his unborn son rather than face the responsibilities of fatherhood and marriage. The cement anchors Scott allegedly used to weigh down Laci's body were never found. Investigators discovered he'd made cement anchors in his warehouse workshop in the days before Laci's disappearance. His warehouse showed evidence of cement work, with dust and residue consistent with making concrete weights. But the anchors themselves, presumably dumped in the bay with Laci's body, were never recovered. This missing evidence was something the defense highlighted, arguing that without the anchors or other physical proof, the prosecution's theory was just speculation. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming enough that the jury didn't need the actual murder weapon or anchors to convict. One of the most haunting aspects of the case is imagining Laci's final moments. Did she know what was happening? Did Scott attack her while she slept, giving her no chance to defend herself? Or did she see it coming? Did she plead for her life and Connor's life? These questions torment those who loved her. The cruelty of not just ending her life, but also disposing of her body in the cold waters of the bay, denying her family even the dignity of a proper burial initially, speaks to Scott's profound lack of humanity. Even in death, he tried to erase her, to make her disappear forever. The case has been analyzed in countless true crime documentaries, books, and podcasts. In 2017, A&E produced a 6-hour documentary series, The Murder of Laci Peterson, featuring interviews with detectives, prosecutors, and people close to the case. In 2024, Netflix released a 3-part series, American Murder, Laci Peterson, offering new perspectives and interviews. The case continues to fascinate because it represents something fundamentally terrifying. The monster who looks like everyone else, the killer hiding behind a smile. Scott Peterson's family, particularly his mother Jackie and sister-in-law Janie, have steadfastly maintained his innocence. They've appeared in documentaries defending him, arguing he's been wrongly convicted. They claim he's a loving son and brother who could never commit such crimes. Their loyalty is understandable but difficult to reconcile with the evidence. Perhaps they genuinely believe he's innocent. Or perhaps they simply cannot accept that someone they love could do something so monstrous. Family members of convicted killers often face this impossible position, torn between love and truth. The impact on the Rocha family is immeasurable. Sharon Rocha has said she lives with Laci's absence every day. Holidays are painful reminders of what was stolen from them. Sharon never got to meet Connor, never got to hold her grandson, never got to watch him grow up. Laci's brother Brent has struggled publicly with grief and anger. The family has been forever altered by violence. No verdict, no sentence, no amount of justice can bring Laci and Connor back. They live with a permanent void that nothing can fill. In the years since Scott's conviction, California's death penalty has become increasingly unlikely to be carried out. California has a moratorium on executions, and even before that, the appeals process for death row inmates typically took decades. Scott Peterson would likely have died of old age before being executed, even if his death sentence hadn't been overturned. Now, with life without parole, he'll spend the rest of his days in prison, aging and forgotten by all but those who remember Laci. The question of why Scott didn't simply divorce Laci if he wanted out of the marriage has been asked countless times. Divorce would have been difficult, expensive, possibly contentious. He would have had to pay child support. His image as the perfect husband would have been shattered. But these are ordinary problems that ordinary people deal with every day without resorting to murder. Scott's choice to kill rather than divorce reveals a profound moral emptiness, a belief that his convenience was more important than human life. He wanted the freedom to be with Amber, the financial benefits of Laci's life insurance, and the sympathy that comes with being a grieving widower. He thought he could have it all if he just eliminated the obstacle in his way. The community of Modesto was deeply affected by the case. This was a town where people knew each other, where crime of this magnitude was shocking. The realization that someone in their community had committed such a heinous act shattered the sense of safety. The extensive searches, the vigils, the thousands of hours volunteers spent looking for Laci, all while Scott knew exactly where she was. The betrayal ran deep. Even today, Modesto residents remember where they were when Laci's remains were found, when Scott was arrested, when the verdict was read. If you're interested in cases like this, understanding how seemingly ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil, make sure to subscribe to True Crime Vault. Hit that like button if you found this investigation compelling. And let me know in the comments, what do you think motivated Scott Peterson? Was it purely about avoiding responsibility? Or was there something darker driving him? Drop your thoughts below. The lessons from the Laci Peterson case extend beyond one family's tragedy. It reminds us that danger can come from unexpected places, that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Scott Peterson was educated, employed, middle class, attractive. He didn't fit the stereotype of a murderer, yet he planned and executed the killing of his pregnant wife with chilling calculation. This case challenges us to look beyond surface appearances, to question narratives that seem too perfect, to pay attention when something feels wrong, even if we can't immediately articulate why. For those studying criminal psychology, the Peterson case offers insights into narcissistic personality types and how they operate. Scott's ability to lie without apparent stress, to maintain multiple deceptions simultaneously, to show no empathy for his victims, these are hallmark traits of certain personality disorders. Understanding these patterns can help identify dangerous individuals before they act. While most people with narcissistic traits never become violent, in combination with other factors such as a desire to escape responsibility, financial pressure, and an existing affair, the results can be deadly. The technological aspects of the case are also noteworthy. This was one of the first major murder cases where cell phone records, internet search history, and GPS data played crucial roles in the investigation. Scott's phone records contradicted his statements about his whereabouts. His internet searches revealed his planning. In 2004, this type of digital evidence was relatively new in criminal trials. Today, it's standard, but the Peterson case helped establish how this evidence could be used effectively in court. Technology that Scott thought would help him maintain his lies ultimately helped expose them. The media's role in the case was both helpful and problematic. Extensive coverage kept Laci's disappearance in the public eye, generating tips and keeping pressure on investigators. But it also created a circus-like atmosphere, with commentators declaring Scott guilty before the trial even began. The question of whether Scott could receive a fair trial given the pre-trial publicity was raised repeatedly. Ultimately, the jury was able to set aside what they'd heard in the media and focus on the evidence presented in court. But the case highlighted ongoing tensions between freedom of the press and the right to a fair trial. What happens to people like Scott Peterson in prison? Inmates convicted of killing pregnant women or children are typically not well received by other prisoners. There's a hierarchy even in prison, and those who harm the vulnerable are at the bottom. Scott has reportedly been kept in protective custody at times for his own safety. He's filed numerous appeals, continued to proclaim his innocence, and granted occasional interviews where he maintains he's been wrongly convicted. Whether he truly believes this or is simply unable to admit his guilt, even to himself, is unclear. Psychologists suggest that some narcissistic individuals can convince themselves of their own lies, creating alternative realities where they're always the victim, never the perpetrator. The impact on Amber Frey's life cannot be overlooked. She became an unwilling public figure, her private life exposed for the world to judge. She faced criticism from some who blamed her for the affair, even though she'd been deceived about Scott's marital status. She showed courage in cooperating with police, knowing it would expose her to public scrutiny. Her testimony was crucial to the conviction. In the years since, Amber has largely avoided the spotlight, focusing on raising her daughter and moving forward with her life. Her story is a reminder that victims of deception suffer too, even when they weren't the primary targets of violence. The legal precedent set by the Peterson case, particularly regarding the second-degree murder charge for Connor, has been significant in California law. Charging someone with murdering an unborn child separate from the mother was somewhat novel at the time. The case reinforced California's fetal homicide laws and influenced how similar cases would be prosecuted in the future. It raised complex questions about personhood, viability, and when life legally begins, questions that extend beyond criminal law into broader ethical and philosophical debates. Looking back 20 years later, the Laci Peterson case remains one of the most infamous murders in American history. It had everything that captures public attention: a beautiful victim, a charming but evil perpetrator, a pregnant woman, an unborn baby, lies and affairs, a dramatic investigation, and ultimately justice. But beyond the sensational elements, it's a reminder of a fundamental truth. Laci Peterson was a real person with hopes and dreams and people who loved her. She was excited to become a mother. She decorated a nursery. She picked out names. She imagined her son's first steps, his first words, his first day of school. All of that was stolen from her by the man who'd promised to love and protect her. Today, Scott Peterson remains in Mather State Prison, serving life without the possibility of parole. His appeals continue, though most legal experts believe his conviction will stand. The evidence against him was simply too overwhelming. Meanwhile, Laci's family continues to grieve, continues to remember, continues to ensure that Laci and Connor are not forgotten. They've turned their tragedy into advocacy, working to support other families of crime victims, fighting for justice for those who can no longer fight for themselves. Though justice was served, though Scott Peterson will spend the rest of his life in prison, the scars of this tragedy remain with everyone who knew and loved Laci. Sharon Rocha will never hold her daughter again. She'll never meet her grandson. Laci's friends lost someone irreplaceable. The community lost its innocence. And the world lost Laci Peterson and Connor Peterson, two people who deserve to live, to love, to experience all the beautiful moments life offers. Their memory deserves to be honored, not as victims in a famous case, but as real people whose lives had value and meaning. This case reminds us to pay attention to the people in our lives, to take concerns seriously, to trust our instincts when something feels wrong. It reminds us that evil can wear a charming smile, that danger can come from those we trust most. And it reminds us that behind every headline, every true crime story, every sensational case, there are real people who loved and were loved. People whose absence leaves permanent scars on those left behind. If this investigation into one of America's most infamous cases has given you insight into how evil can hide behind a perfect facade, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Vault. We dive deep into the cases that changed history, the investigations that revealed uncomfortable truths, and the mysteries that still haunt us. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your thoughts on the Scott Peterson case. What detail did you find most compelling? What question still remains unanswered for you? And remember, these aren't just stories. These are real people, real lives, and real tragedies that deserve to be remembered with respect and dignity. Laci Peterson and Connor Peterson deserve to be more than victims in a famous case. They deserve to be remembered as the people they were and the future that was stolen from them.